after the shooting of Renee Good, you said ICE made some mistakes. What were the mistakes?
Well, look, I'm not happy with the two incidents. It's not, it's both of them, not one or the other. He was not an angel, and she was not an angel.
Tonight, the White House tried to close a door it helped crack open. According to public reporting, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said President Donald Trump has no formal plans to deploy ICE agents to polling sites in November's midterm elections, yet she also refused to guarantee that agents would not be around voting locations. That single gap, no plan but not ruled out, is the pressure point. It echoes Trump ally Steve Bannon saying ICE would surround the polls. In an election system built on predictable rules, ambiguity becomes a form of force, and it lands on voters long before it lands in court. According to public reporting, the White House posture was framed as reassurance. No formal plans for ICE at polling sites. The miscalculation is embedded in what came next. Leavitt would not guarantee ICE would be absent around a polling location in November. Trump's team often treats ambiguity as leverage, a way to keep opponents guessing and allies energized. But in election administration, ambiguity is not leverage. It is evidence of risk. Trump has been urging Republicans to nationalize and take over voting in at least 15 unspecified locations, while repeating claims of widespread fraud that multiple outlets describe as false or unsubstantiated. That posture narrows his room to maneuver because elections are run through a decentralized system designed to deny any sitting president direct control. When Trump signals federal takeover, institutions respond the way they always do, by locking down process, documenting intent, and preparing legal boundaries. The first guardrail is already on the public record. According to Reuters, federal law prohibits the president from deploying military troops at any location holding a general or special election, and several states criminalize carrying firearms at or near polling places. That matters because the fear dynamic does not require troops to be present. The intimidation effect comes from proximity and symbolism, uniforms, authority, and the sense that a ballot could trigger scrutiny. According to Reuters, immigration enforcement, in particular, has caused both U.S. citizens and legal residents to stay home out of fear of detention or racial profiling. Institutional resistance is also visible inside his own party. Reuters reported Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he is not in favor of federalizing elections, and House Speaker Mike Johnson noted that elections have always been the responsibility of the states. That is not friendly advice. It is a constraint. It signals that even if Trump wants to push a federal presence narrative, the legislative power centers he needs are not willing to absorb the blast radius. The White House tried to sound in control, but the refusal to rule anything out is the marker of a presidency running out of clean options. The controversy did not start with an executive order. It started with a permission slip written in rhetoric. According to public reporting, Steve Bannon said on his War Room podcast, "You're damn right we're going to have ICE surround the polls come November." That line matters because it forces the White House to answer a scenario it claims it is not planning. When Leavitt treated the question as hypothetical and still refused to provide a guarantee, the administration effectively validated that the scenario is plausible enough to discuss in the open. This is where Trump's decision-making pattern becomes visible. He elevates a posture first, then lets allies inflate it into a threat, then asks institutions to tolerate the ambiguity. That pattern works when the subject is branding or negotiation. It fails when the subject is election access. Election rules are not suggestion. They are compliance systems. Once a federal law enforcement presence becomes part of the conversation, state officials, election administrators, and civil rights organizations translate it into policies, training, and legal strategy. According to a Brennan Center explainer published in October 2025, federal and state election laws ban federal forces from polling places and treat interference or intimidation as criminal conduct, and it argues that there is no emergency power that lets a president override those protections. The point is not that Trump has already ordered a violation. The point is that his rhetoric forces every institution around the election to prepare for boundary testing. Preparation looks boring, but it is destabilizing. It builds suspicion into the process before a single ballot is cast. The intimidation pathway is also structurally obvious. The ACLU's federal agents at the polls guidance warns that voters have the right to cast a ballot without fear of deception or intimidation and urges people to know their rights. Immigration enforcement carries special weight because the mere presence of ICE can change the perceived cost of showing up. Reuters noted that immigration enforcement, in particular, has caused U.S. citizens and legal residents to stay home out of fear of detention or racial profiling. In that environment, near the polls becomes a psychological barrier, not a policy detail. And the risk compounds. The Brennan Center's analysis on armed intimidation argues that voter suppression by intimidation is more likely than violence, and that guns are increasingly wielded as tools of intimidation. Reuters reported that several states criminalize carrying firearms at or near polling places, which shows officials already anticipate intimidation dynamics around elections. Trump's failure is not only moral or rhetorical, it is strategic. By refusing to rule out ICE around polling locations, he hands his critics a documented wedge, a scenario that can be framed as voter intimidation even without a confirmed deployment. He also triggers resistance from two directions at once. Democrats can use the record to warn about intimidation, and Republicans who insist elections are state-run can treat Trump's federalization talk as a liability. In Reuters reporting, Thune and Johnson already laid down the boundary. That is what makes the White House line so dangerous. When you say there is no plan but also no limit, you invite the institutional system to define your limit for you in lawsuits, state rules, and public warnings. The administration's ambiguity is no longer a tactic. It is the accelerant that pushes the election environment toward a more brittle, litigated, and distrustful state. The climax in this story is not a convoy of agents at a school gym. It is a line of language that turns into a compliance event. No formal plans, paired with "I can't guarantee," is not neutral. It is a signal that the White House is willing to keep the option space open even when the option itself is politically toxic. According to Reuters, Trump said Republicans should nationalize and take over, voting in at least 15 unspecified locations. In the same Reuters reporting, his former advisor Steve Bannon said on his podcast, "You're damn right we're going to have ICE surround the polls come November." And Leavitt responded that she had not heard the president discuss any formal plans, while adding, "I can't guarantee that an ICE agent won't be around a polling location in November." Put those lines together and the institutional risk becomes predictable, not because anyone has proven a deployment, but because systems treat stated intent as a variable that must be managed. Election administration is built around rules that must be known in advance, recorded, and enforceable. Trump's miscalculation is that he treats elections like a pressure campaign he can win by escalation. But elections are not run by White House messaging. They are run by county and state administrators operating under statutes, court oversight, and decentralized authority designed to deny any sitting president direct control. When Trump pushes a federal takeover posture, he is not only challenging Democrats, he is challenging the architecture that keeps the process legitimate. This is where the Brennan Center's October 2025 explainer becomes the hard object in the room. According to that analysis, federal and state election laws explicitly prohibit the federal government from deploying federal troops or armed federal law enforcement to any polling place, and it describes voter intimidation by federal agents as criminal conduct. It further argues that emergency declarations do not create authority over elections, and that even the Insurrection Act does not permit illegal actions. This is not a partisan talking point. It is a published legal claim framework that attorneys can cite, officials can reference, and judges can read without waiting for an incident. The White House tries to avoid that collision by hiding inside a technicality. No formal plans can be true and still function as a threat, because intimidation does not require a signed order. It requires uncertainty. Reuters explicitly noted that immigration enforcement has caused U.S. citizens and legal residents to stay home out of fear of detention or racial profiling. In that context, a refusal to guarantee ICE will not be around polling locations becomes the mechanism, not the footnote. It shifts the burden onto voters and local officials to gamble on safety. The ACLU guidance on federal agents at the polls, last updated the 3rd of November 2025, states that eligible citizens have the right to cast a ballot without fear of deception or intimidation, and urges voters to learn their rights. The critical point is that civil liberties organizations are building public-facing infrastructure for this scenario. That signals a broader institutional response. The system anticipates fear and tries to neutralize it before it suppresses turnout. That defensive posture can translate into more poll observers, more hotline calls, more formal complaints, and more litigation-ready documentation, even when nothing happens on the ground, because the job of an election system is to reduce uncertainty before it becomes a crisis. Institutional resistance also shows up inside Trump's governing coalition. Reuters reported that Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he is not in favor of federalizing elections, and House Speaker Mike Johnson said election administration has always been the responsibility of the states. That is a boundary being announced. It signals that even if Trump wants to make nationalized voting more than a slogan, the leadership he needs is unwilling to carry it. Trump looks forceful on camera, but the people who control the legislative pipeline are signaling that they will not hand him the tools. Then there is the broader pattern of federal pressure around election administration. Reuters reported that the Justice Department has been suing nearly 24 states over their voter rolls and has stepped up pressure on Democratic-led states to turn over voter data. Those actions are not the same as placing agents at polling sites, and they should not be described as such. But they matter because they establish an environment in which federal power is already moving through election systems. In an environment of high suspicion, the public does not separate lawsuits over voter rolls from agents near polling sites with legal precision. It becomes one narrative: federal pressure aimed at the act of voting itself. Reuters also reported that the FBI searched an election office in Georgia's Fulton County for records related to the 2020 election. That kind of federal action, even when tied to a warrant and limited to records, reinforces the sense that election infrastructure is becoming a contested site as Trump continues to press false claims about fraud. The Brennan Center's analysis on armed intimidation adds another pressure point grounded in documented trends. It argues that voter suppression by intimidation is more likely than violence and that guns are increasingly being used as tools of intimidation. Reuters noted that several states criminalize carrying firearms at or near polling places, which shows officials already anticipate intimidation dynamics around elections. When Trump's allies normalize the idea of surrounding polls, they amplify exactly the kind of intimidation signal states have been trying to keep away from voting lines. Trump's options narrow because the system punishes ambiguity. If he commits to zero presence, he undercuts the faction demanding a show of force and clashes with his own nationalized posture. If he keeps refusing to rule it out, he fuels intimidation claims and invites injunctions, monitoring efforts, and intensified public warnings. If he tries to operationalize it, he runs into the legal wall described in public analysis and the political wall described by his own party's leaders. As November approaches, the White House loses the ability to hide behind the word hypothetical, because every refusal to guarantee the absence of federal agents makes the election environment more defensive and more fragile. By the time the White House says there is no plan, the damage is already in motion, because uncertainty is the product. According to public reporting, Leavitt did not simply deny the scenario. She refused to guarantee it would not happen. That turns the election environment into a risk management exercise for everyone else. The first consequence is narrative inversion. Trump wants to frame election administration as something that must be seized and controlled. The public record flips it into a story about intimidation and constitutional boundaries. Reuters reported Democrats have raised concerns that Trump could deploy troops at polling locations to intimidate voters and interfere with November's elections. Even when the White House calls it hypothetical, the refusal to rule it out keeps the concern alive, and it becomes a stable storyline with dated quotes and a documented trail. The second consequence is operational hardening at the state and local level. Election officials cannot rely on vibes. They rely on written rules, chain of command clarity, and clear lines between election operations and law enforcement. The Brennan Center's explainer argues that both federal and state laws prohibit federal forces from polling places and that intimidation by federal agents is criminal. That kind of public analysis does not stay in a think tank. It becomes language in letters from state attorneys general, guidance for election workers, and the kind of record a court can use when deciding whether to impose guardrails. When institutions harden, the president's flexibility shrinks. The third consequence is targeted chilling. According to Reuters, immigration enforcement has caused citizens and legal residents to stay home out of fear of detention or racial profiling. That is a concrete mechanism of suppression. Fear changes turnout. It does not require mass arrests. It does not require an official order. It requires the belief that showing up could be unsafe. When the White House refuses to guarantee restraint, it plants exactly that belief. The fourth consequence is coalition fracture. Reuters reported Thune and Johnson resisted Trump's call to federalize elections. That means Trump cannot credibly threaten a federal takeover while also claiming he represents stable governance, because the governing coalition itself is telling the country the idea is out of bounds. A president who is truly in control does not need to rely on allies whispering intimidation fantasies into microphones. Another pressure point comes from the way intimidation is defined. The Brennan Center's analysis on armed intimidation argues that voter suppression by intimidation is more likely than violence, and that guns are increasingly used as tools of intimidation. Reuters reported that several states criminalize carrying firearms at or near polling places. That matters because it shows officials already treat the polling place as a protected zone where the appearance of force can be the harm. The ACLU's federal agents at the polls guidance reinforces that the system anticipates this harm. It stresses that voters must be able to cast ballots without fear and encourages planning ahead. In practice, that can mean more hotlines, more poll worker guidance, and more documentation of any perceived interference. It turns the election into a monitored environment where every federal move is contested. What remains is a shrinking corridor where the White House can neither guarantee restraint nor safely escalate without igniting the legal and political tripwires already documented in public reporting. What the White House called a silly hypothetical has already hardened into a documented pattern. Trump escalates, allies amplify, institutions lock down, and then the administration pretends it never offered the threat. According to Reuters, there were no formal plans to deploy ICE at polling sites, yet the White House refused to guarantee agents would not be around voting locations. That posture is the tell. A confident presidency closes doors. A reactive one keeps doors ajar and calls the fear hypothetical, while benefiting from the intimidation effect. Trump's remaining options are narrow and unglamorous. The safest path is a public commitment that federal immigration enforcement will not be used to hover around polling places, paired with clear guidance to agencies and cooperation with state election officials. The political cost is that it undercuts the hardline storyline he and his allies have been selling. The opposite path, keeping the option open, is worse. It invites lawsuits, injunction fights, and state countermeasures designed to keep intimidation cues away from the polls, all while deepening public distrust. The deeper consequence is trust erosion. The Brennan Center's explainer argues legal barriers treat interference and intimidation as crimes, and the ACLU warns that voters must be able to cast ballots without fear. When Trump plays chicken with that principle, he turns election administration into a battlefield of suspicion and paperwork, not a civic routine. If you want more fact-checked reporting in this investigative, documentary style, subscribe and follow the series